participate in the labor force. For India, it's about 32%. Yeah.
Is this organized?
No, it's not. It's complete. It's from the NSS data, so it's both informal and formal. This is complete. So when you look at, again, as I said, over the next 3 decades, this is just looking at working age women as a share of total women, the female population. And this trend obviously looks pretty similar for men. It's a little bit more concentrated in women. It's really over the next 3 decades that we have this, what I call this sweet spot, where you get the biggest bang for your buck if you can actually expand participation rates. And this is important, and it's an important question in terms of talent as well as in terms of maths. And this chart shows us why. If you look at our dependency ratios, and this is when we always talk about how great our demographics are, we can talk about it in glowing terms. And when we do, we say things like this: we have 7.6 workers for every retiree. Right, but when you look at actual participation rates, the people that are actually engaged in the labor force, that number goes all the way down to 4.9. So in reality, we really only have 4.9 workers per every retiree. If you pull that out to 2035 and we don't increase participation rates, that goes to 2.7 workers. We look like a Japan. Rather than if we could increase our participation rates, we would look more like a 4.2, which is much more stable. So anything and we really focus on this, when we're looking at employment participation, we're looking at anything. What's changed in terms of employment by region, employment by sector, employment by education? And when you look from 2003, nothing really has changed. The only big increase that we've seen is this rise that we've just started to see between 2000 and 2005 in women's participation rates, and that's why we think it's so important. I'll just skip over these for the sake of time, but you can always come back to me if anyone's interested. I'll just focus on this in this chart, and we all know this anecdotally, but this is why I think our country gets hit twice, because we were first hit by low education levels, but now when you look at both the share of women and men that actually participate in the labor force, as you divide it by education levels, you'll see for men, which is the light blue bar, as they get more educated, they actually start to work more, and that's the pattern that you see world over. When you look at the shape for women, you'll see that as they get more educated, they actually work less, and that starts to change when you get to graduate levels and above. So it's this U-shaped curve. And this is very, very idiosyncratic. You don't see this in many other countries, and you don't see it in the rest of Asia. And we think this is important because there's a huge pool. As I said before, first we're hit by low education levels, but then we have a big share of population that's educated but isn't participating in the labor force. So now just to move to the second trend that we were talking about in terms of looking at why this age structure matters so much now for India. When we're looking at income per capita, let's say, and you compare India and China, India is the gray line. You can actually see in 1980, India's income per capita was higher than China's. And it was in the 1990s where they sort of flipped over and China started to take off. Now, if you mapped that against age structure, and again, I talked about this in that earlier slide on the demographic contribution. If you look at China's age structure, the ratio of working age to non-working age population, you'll see that it correlates well. It's not a causation, but it correlates well with that same time horizon for income per capita. So it was really in the 1980s that you got this steep rise in working age population to total population. Now what you're seeing in China in 2010 is this inflection point where now it's starting to decrease. And there isn't another country that's seen such a rapid increase and decrease in this ratio. So this is something that, again, people know about, but we've never really seen before. So in the next 2 decades, it's going to be an incredibly difficult dynamic that the Chinese economy is going to have to deal with. India, on the other hand, has a much more gradual rise over a much longer time. So again, as you see it, it's really in this 2000-2010 sort of range where you start to get this rise in that age structure. And that's whenever we talk about this boost and how it contributes to overall GDP growth, this is that trend that plays out into those themes. Another way to look at it is just looking at population pyramids. So when you're looking at the share of the population by age group, you'll see that this chart looks at India and it's just split between male and female in 1990. If you look from 1950 to 1990, this pyramid looks basically like this. So it's thick at the bottom, goes up, it's very triangular. When you fast forward to 2010, all of a sudden, for the first time, you start to see that shape shift a little bit and get a little bit rounder. So we're starting to see people enter the 20 to 30 age bracket. Now when you get to 2030, it's really quite dramatic. So we get a much more balancing in the middle age, in our bulge, in the middle age part of the population. And 2050, we're moving on up. So again, this is something where we haven't seen movement from 1950 to 2000, and then all of a sudden from 2000 to 2050, you get a pretty massive shift in what that shape looks like. So again, how this translates into overall labor force is basically this chart. If you look at the addition to the global labor force just over this decade, just between 2011 and 2020, look at how much India has to contribute to the world. We're adding 80 million people to the labor force, to the global labor force, compared to a China, which is less than 20 million. And when you look at Japan, it's actually a negative contribution. So for employment patterns and for the labor force, I guess I can't belabor the point anymore, this decade is really our decade. And the big challenge is going to be, how do we generate enough jobs? Services obviously isn't going to be enough, but how are we going to generate enough jobs to be able to meet that labor force coming online in this decade? Education can be part of the answer, but it's a much longer term answer. It's really facing us right now. As we start to get more people moving into this working age population, the other big change that we see is that consumption patterns tend to change pretty rapidly. And so when we've kind of mapped out how we think consumption is going to evolve, this chart kind of shows it overall, but it's broken apart in this chart by different sectors. The biggest sectors that we think are going to see growth in consumption spending are health, recreation, culture, and education, and hotels and restaurants. So we're seeing more than quadrupling in some of these sectors, while in other sectors you're seeing mostly a tripling over the course of this decade alone. And so those are particularly these services sectors is where we see massive consumption spending. When you look at the youth overall, the youth devote comparatively more of their spending basket to things like food, beverages, personal care, transport, and health. And so when we mapped this out, and for us, over this decade, it's really that 25 to 35-year-old age group that sees the biggest growth in population. And then it's followed by that light blue bar, which is 35 to 64. So we're going to leave it at that. The last section that I wanted to talk about was just to highlight some research that we've done looking at urbanization, because I mentioned that's the other big theme in terms of how we think that structural dynamics are going to play out in the country. One of the big things I want to say is that a lot of people think that this story on urbanization is pretty well known. We've seen it in other countries, and so India is just going to follow along the same lines. But in actuality, India is following a very, very different pattern, very different to the rest of the region. Typically what you see is that as countries' economies grow, urbanization grows in tandem. What you see for India is actually the opposite. Our rates of urbanization peaked in the 1970s, that's that line, and then it's been slowing ever since. And again, I really want to stress that we haven't seen that in many other places. A lot of the reason for this is probably twofold. One, we just haven't built the kind of infrastructure necessary to support the amount of people that want to move into urban spaces. So I think particularly in places like Chandigarh, you do see a lot of movement, but there's massive commutes and seasonal migration that takes place that doesn't come into the numbers. But secondly, at a policy level, we've also always had a policy that supported small-scale industries. So you didn't have that economies of scale argument that you've seen in other countries. Now, what we think has happened is that between 2005 and 2010 is when, again, this curve has started to plateau, and it's starting to take off once again. So now we're going to see that inflection point really play itself out. We've done another study. We've looked at what has been the biggest contribution to the growth that we have seen in urban areas. And interestingly, it's not migration, even though media makes migration out to be a huge story, and it is. But in terms of looking at the actual data, most of the increase in India's urban spaces has actually been due to natural increase. So that's about 75% of all the growth in India's cities are just people within these cities having kids. And about 12 to 15% of it is actually migration. And again, that ratio is changing as of now. It's only just started to change. When you look at India's the level of urbanization, which we talked about in the last slide, but also the change in urban share, it's also been slower. So we've seen India's urbanization rates be lower than the rest of the region, but it's also been much slower to catch up. And again, that's just about to change. Part of this also has to do with what's happening in rural India, right? We have a lot of myths about rural India, and in terms of what's happening in terms of growth. And one of the biggest things is that we usually just conflate agriculture with rural India. That might have been the case in the 1970s. But even if you look at 2000, and this shape would look even more dramatically if you pulled it out to 2010, only half of the economy is really driven by agriculture. And when you look at the biggest sources of employment increases, as well as incremental growth to the economy, it's really been in manufacturing and services in rural India. So whenever we talk about manufacturing in India, about 42% of manufacturing takes place in what we call rural India. Now, we have a lot of problems with our definitions of rural and urban in this country, but that being said, there's a lot of dynamism that's happening outside of agriculture, and that's also leading to sort of different patterns in urbanization. What we think this means for India is that it's going to look a little different to the rest of the region. Now, we're not going to grow as much by cities, but we're going to have a lot of growth in second and third tier towns, and kind of growing outside of our cities in terms of smaller metros. So what we tried to do was to look at what the top 20 cities were in India and how they're growing. We did a study with the National Council of Applied Economic Research. So we took the National Household Income and Consumption Survey and tried to figure out what are our big cities. And not to look at the cities in terms of a population cut, which is traditionally what people do, but to really look at population in the context of spending. So what cities are really spending? How are their household consumption patterns changing? Again, as you're looking at India compared to other countries, radically different across geography. So to talk about averages really gives you no real sense of what's happening, because the averages mask these huge swings as you go from north to south, east to west. As you can see, our niche cities, of which Chandigarh is one, geographically very concentrated, right, in Punjab. So a lot of this, and we did that on purpose because we wanted the data to really tell the story of what's happening in terms of geography. And when we looked at these different cities, so mega cities, which were your typical top 8 high population, above 5 million people cities, we wanted to compare them as well to second tier cities, which were our boom towns, which follow that traditional story of high population, but also high spend per households. But niche cities were the really interesting ones, because in niche cities you had populations that were 1 million or less. Their household income levels were probably at or slightly below what you see in mega cities, but their spending propensities, so the share of income actually spent by these households, are radically higher than what you see in these other city groups. And what this means is that in terms of looking at how would you say, about if you look at sectors that are classically geared towards demographics, so things like food and beverages, financial services, and so on, they might look at the boom towns, the tier 2 cities first. But when you're looking at how quickly consumer patterns evolve, niche cities actually have much deeper, more addressable markets. And I think sitting here, that's something that's well known. But when you're looking at things like leisure, healthcare, education, housing, these markets look much bigger and more addressable in these niche cities compared to the other two. So together, these top 20 cities make up less than 10% of India's population, but they're obviously important because they generate more than 30% of income. And obviously, in terms of absolute levels, the mega cities still are the core component of that. But in terms of growth, what we've really seen is that boom towns, these tier 2 cities, at least over the last period between 2005 and 2010, really showed the fastest growth. So again, it's hard to see, but it's Surat and Nagpur that showed the highest growth. And if you looked at the tier 2 cities, are like the bookends. They show the highest, they're the most volatile. They show the highest growth as well as the slowest growth. When you look at the niche cities, they're slightly more inwards. And when you look at the most stable growth, the average growth, that's really the mega cities. And what we think is that on average, we saw all of these cities grow at about a little less than 12% year over year between 2004 and 2008. And we think we're going to see about 11% between this period and 2015. Surat and yeah, it's the same data source. So we were all working on this at the same time. Same data source, which is the NCAR.
The conclusions are very different.
somewhat different. I mean, they looked at a bigger set of 40 cities. And we looked at.
We compared Chandigarh and Surat. The data was that Chandigarh will probably have near developing country in terms of per capita. They're looking at 40K per year. That's per capita in 2020.
Yeah.
Whereas Surat would be still at 20.
Well, if you look at this, it's going to be hard to see this data, but we can share it with you. If you look at Surat and Chandigarh, they're both on this table. So when you look at just taking straight average household income levels, you'll see that Chandigarh and Mumbai, followed by Surat, have the highest household income levels. When you adjust for differences in cost of living, you get slight changes. So adjusting for cost of living, Surat actually has the highest household income levels, followed by Chandigarh. So Chandigarh doesn't change dramatically. And these cities have become quite important. If you look at Surat, it became very important because it's the youngest city of the entire group, highest migration levels, biggest markets if you look at things like apparel and so on. So it's an interesting story, but different in terms of what markets you're looking at. Already by 2007, 2008, when we were looking at this study, more than half of Chandigarh's households were middle class, and that's a big cusp that we're always looking at to see when cities cross these thresholds. When you look at all of the 20 cities together, we only have about a little less than 40%. It's about 38% of all households are in middle class. So Chandigarh is obviously slightly higher in terms of its middle class. When you look at this period compared to 2015, 2016, by then you get a big rise in the middle class, but an even steeper off of a lower base, but a very steep rise in the high income class. It goes from about 7% of all households to about 16%. As I mentioned before, when you look at spending propensity, so for every household's income levels, how much of that income they spend in a given year, you'll see very dramatic differences. Mumbai and Ahmedabad only spend less than half of their income in a given year. If you go to Bhopal and Jalandhar, they spend close to 80% of their incomes. The flip side of that is that savings has different implications. When you look at savings and surplus income, which is accrued, but off of this survey was the best proxy that we had, about 19%, so close to a fifth of all these households still prefer to keep surplus income at home. And for niche cities, that was quite a bit higher. Niche cities, this particular group of cities, have the highest asset penetration, but they have the lowest financial penetration. And when you look at asset penetration in Chandigarh, again, much higher than the 20-city average. But again, one of the highest asset penetrations if you look across that white goods segment that we were talking about. So just to close, I think 5 of our long-range macro predictions for India is that within a decade, we think following Chandigarh, more than half of all of households in India's top 20 cities will be middle class. That's a really key sort of indicator to watch in terms of development phases for different countries. Secondly, overall consumption expenditure should grow about 3.5 times over the next 10 years alone. So again, huge implications for various sectors. Inflation will remain higher throughout the next decade, so it's probably going to trend closer to 7.5%. And this is due to both supply side shortages as well as the structural demand shifts that I talked about earlier. We think more women in the workforce will add about $110 billion to the economy over the next decade alone, so by no means a small impact. And again, when we looked at this, the sectors that benefited the most from this trend were financial services, any spending on children, education, tutorials, clothing, toys, and so on, as well as personal care and transportation. And finally, the age group that we see witnessing the fastest population growth of this period will be the 25 to 34-year-old age group. I'll leave it at that. I think I spoke more than that.
So as you can see, this if you think about macro terms, how it all comes together. When I was listening to Rupa through the presentation, there were a few things that that I was observing. That in India, all of us are talking about growth. We are all going gung-ho. We talk about democratic dividend, and then and India, as Rupa says, this is potentially India's decade, really. So when you look at that, there are also some danger signs along the way. So this train that's moving at a high speed, the bullet train that's going, things that I observed is that, for example, India is much more vulnerable to an oil shock than China. So some of your earlier slides that showed. And also the fact that a lot of our women that could come into employment, if they don't, then we are really underachieving as an economy. So what do we do about that? And of course, in the whole city analysis, as you can see, that India is so different with Chandigarh being in a niche city category like Surat. And so what does it mean for all you entrepreneurs here? Those are the kind of things that are coming to my mind. My question to Rupa is also that, what do you see as the main things that could really derail this bullet train? You have any thoughts on that?
I think I won't spend a lot of time on infrastructure because we all have heard that again and again. But I actually think the biggest risk